Thank you for watching this video of the Spyderco Salt 1 RIT dye process. I went ahead and dyed these knives ahead of time just to be sure that the formula I was using worked and that I could achieve the results that I was hoping to achieve. In this case, I actually used two different types of RIT dye. I used a racing red synthetic fiber dye at a temperature above 200 degrees Fahrenheit and with a little bit of liquid dish detergent mixed in. For the Spyderco Salt 1 on top, I used an aquamarine all-purpose RIT dye, which only had to be heated up to temperatures around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, but they recommend mixing vinegar in with the dye to increase the intensity of the dye color as well as the penetration of the dye. In order to dye each knife, I used two separate tin cans that used to contain vegetables. I simply rinsed out and cleaned each can and then boiled water in a pot to be added to the tin can and then kept on the stove so that the temperature could be maintained throughout the dyeing process. For each knife, I simply held the blade with my fingers and dipped the knife in at an angle to achieve this fade starting at this first pin. And after only a few minutes in the racing red synthetic fiber dye, I had already achieved a brilliant orange right up past the back lock, and I was getting a much deeper red towards the bottom of the handle, which is exactly what I wanted. It only took between 3 and 4 minutes to get this dark red on the bottom of the handle. All I had to do was gradually dip lower and lower into the dye. And after a while, I was only dipping the bottom inch of the knife into the dye. That orange color there at the first rivet was achieved in one single dunk. And between each dunk into the dye, I would rinse with hot water just to be sure I was getting the right fade that I was hoping for. I did the same thing with the Spyderco Salt 1 on top using the all-purpose aquamarine dye, except they recommend mixing vinegar in to increase the intensity of the color. But just like with the racing red, I held onto the blade and I dipped the knife each time, rinsing it, checking for the color I was looking for. And I did appreciate the bluish tinge to the aquamarine. Obviously, you want to consider colors that will mix well with the color of the handle that will be dyed. But as opposed to an olive drab green or a forest green, I really wanted the bluish hues to come out, and I was glad that I was patient with myself. The racing red synthetic fiber dye only took a few minutes. The aquamarine dye took a little bit longer, maybe twice as long for the very tip of the end, which I wanted to be nice and dark and bluish green, kind of an ocean blue green. But overall, I was very pleased with the process, how simple it was, and obviously that I didn't ruin two of my favorite knives. Both of these Salt 1 knives are pinned, which means they cannot be adjusted. After some use and some wear and a little bit of torquing, with these pinned salt knives, you can see that the scales will eventually pull away from the locking mechanism. This can't really be helped other than to put it in a vise and try and put some pressure back on it. That will add some tension to your blade closure. This one is one of the newer Salt 1s, or I should say it's old, but newer than this top Salt 1. The top Salt 1 was actually one of the first where they didn't have an H1. They actually laser engraved it with Salt 1 on the blade. And then, of course, you see H1 Spyderco in Seki City, Japan. But this one is probably, I think, from 2004, somewhere around there. This one is a little bit newer, but still has the pin or the riveted pivot as opposed to the updated Torx. Here's the racing red synthetic dye. Here's the aquamarine all-purpose RIT dye. Each of these bottles has explicit instructions on the back explaining that they need to be heated up. They do recommend mixing each of these with a small amount of liquid dish detergent. The recipe that's on here calls for 3 gallons of water, so obviously you'll have to tone down the recipe, scale it down a little bit. A dab of dish detergent in the synthetic dye is all you need, and for the all-purpose dye, it's recommended that you add a little bit of white vinegar. I would encourage folks to try this. It's an easy arts and crafts kind of a project. It takes maybe 10 minutes max, even with setup and cleanup, and it's a cost-effective, interesting way to modify and adapt your knives, make them more personal. I was pleased with the process and with the results, so I felt like sharing it. It's actually quite easy and kind of fun. Thanks for watching, and as always, enjoy your knives.